Here is Diamine Citrus Ice, an orange shimmering ink.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
I will call this an orange ink because of the name being citrus, but I see it more as a yellow that really shades to orange, or it can be a very good yellow like orange for people who haven't been able to find a yellow but really want one. Now, I'm exceedingly happy with how easy this is to read from the page with, as mentioned, some decent shading. It does well on non-fountain pen friendly paper, but you will lose the shimmer in this ink. If you like shimmer inks, which I do, and you like yellow inks, which I do, I think a bottle would be a good investment into your enjoyment of fountain pens. The pen for today is an Esterbrook SD Sea Glass with a fine nib.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
I think the tone on the page here really shows why I would call it a yellow that shades to orange, but if you want to stay with orange, that's fine. I'm going to call it just because of the name. This does not feather, does not spread. The shimmering comes through very pleasantly, not overbearing, not making it hard to read at all. It does shade exceedingly well. Oakenshield would be proud. When you look at Oakenshield, I don't know that you get a letter that doesn't have some amount of shading that's going on inside of it. If you were looking for that, it was on the middle of the second line. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue these very shimmery notes.
Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer.
Here is Diamine Amazing Amethyst. Here is Diamine Amber. Here is Diamine Ancient Copper. Here is Diamine Apple Glory.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
The tone we get on the page here is the same as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It certainly shades less than it did on the Clairfontaine, but there are areas that it does shade. If you look at there on the second line, where the T is lighter than the H that follows it. The E lightens up a little darker into the IR at the end. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems for shimmery notes.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, no spread. The shimmer is not coming through. It was really absorbed by this paper. There is light little bits of shading that happen, like luck on the first line, where the K is a little bit darker than the rest of the word. But for the most part, we're not seeing a ton of shading. I also don't think that the tone of this paper really goes well with this ink. It doesn't have it looking at its best. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, easily continuing the shimmery notes.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but we're looking at this quad rule and it really gets lost in the ruling of this paper. Now, the ruling doesn't cut through the ink, showing that it's a bit more opaque than you would think of for such a light ink, but it's just that Any other color on the page, I think, eats this up. I think what this really shows is that this would be a great second color on the page, helping to draw attention from whatever your primary color was as you add to your notes. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems as you continue writing.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is KWZ Orange. Here is Lamy Mango. Here is Mont Blanc Gandhi. Here is Noodler's Apache Sunset.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
What we get here is slightly lighter and more muted than we had on the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is giving some shading. The shimmer is kind of eaten up by this paper, but this paper would do that. The quad rule eats this ink up. It really, you see the quad more than you see the ink. Not a good combination for students to use in their lab notebooks. This would be not happy note-taking. Looking at the back of the page, though, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, so you could continue some of those unhappy notes.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Monteverde Caribbean Blue. Here is Geherbon Café des Isles. Here is Geherbon Emerald of Chavour. Here is Krishna Moonview.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we get a tone that is definitely lighter and definitely yellow as a color, not orange at all. Very different in that way from the Clairfontaine. Lighter, brighter color. Very little for feather, very little for spread. I do think you can read this on the page without any kind of a problem. I think this is actually a very good match for what's going on in this paper. I'm really happy here. Looking at the back of the page, though we can see a couple areas that it did get deeper into the paper, if you were writing exclusively with this ink on the paper on both sides, I think you could get away with it and not destroy your notes on both sides of the paper. Makes it a huge win. The not huge win would be reading a full page of yellow ink. Just not my preference, but I think the performance is great.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This Esterbrook has a medium flow fine nib and puts down a very nice orange or yellow, and the shimmer has no clogging issues at all. It shades well, which is always nice. Now, off camera, I put this into a gusher of a music nib, and it didn't really change the tone that much, but it did put down more shimmer, as you would expect. Naturally, I would say the added amount of shimmer and the wider lines put me onto a gusher of a broad as my choice for this ink.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.